Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Klassen. I'm an executive producer at Cable Labs. We are based in Louisville, and we also have a second office out in Sunnyvale. And so my job, originally coming into Cable Labs, was a creative. I have a cinematic background. I taught new media production at USC when I was in Los Angeles and spent a lot of time in the industry out there. So I was hired on originally as this creative film guy coming into the whole thing. And over the course of my time there, I was introduced to all kinds of different technologies, as you can imagine. And as the years progressed, I ended up becoming a video engineer, doing all this work inside of the new HDR technology that was coming out. We were doing new workflows with that. And then we started really looking at VR and AR and what that means. And in the sense of Cable Labs, so Cable Labs is it's a consortium for the cable industry. So we're a nonprofit, and all the cable companies most of the cable companies across the world are members of Cable Labs. We have over 50 members, Comcast being our biggest member. So what we do is we look at solutions for how to scale delivery into homes all across the nation and all across the world. So when we're talking about VR, this is a major issue because, as you know, with VR technology, you have to have a certain frame rate that refreshes at a certain speed, and you need to have that frame rate inside the goggles. Otherwise, the goggles tilt not according to where your eyes are going. And the evolutionary response to that is we purge because we have been, our body believes that we've eaten something poisonous, and this is what happens. So unless you have an expensive gaming computer in your home, you cannot really run VR right now. Not 6DoF VR, 6 Degrees of Freedom VR. Right now you can download 3 Degrees of Freedom VR, just shot with a camera, but you can't actually get that full agency inside your environment unless you have that gaming computer. So here I am working at Cable Labs, and I'm becoming a video engineer. We're thinking about visionary ideas that go out anywhere from 3 to 8 to 10 years out. And we're looking at these technologies and playing with them and getting used to them and getting our hands dirty and trying to understand, is this compelling? And so about 3 years ago, I went out to meet a friend of mine from Fox, 20th Century Fox, Ted Schilowitz. He was the producer of the Wild VR title that came out. This was about 3 years ago. And it was one of the first smart 360 VR experiences. And did anybody see the movie Wild with Reese Witherspoon, where she's walking down the Pacific Crest Trail and she's doing soul searching, and her mother is a spirit in the film, and she goes through this whole experience. They produced this VR experience around this where it was filmed with a 360 camera, and it was placed on the side of a mountain, and here's this path. And Reese Witherspoon comes walking down the path and sits on a rock, and you're sort of watching this. And she has a conversation with her mother who shows up in the scene, and then they have a conversation, and then she gets up and continues, and that's the experience. Now, what happened on my end was that I was inspired by how bad it was. Because here I am, I grew up in Boulder. I love the outdoors. Going on a hike is like sacred to me. And here comes this person walking down the path. And when you're in 360 VR, if you've ever done it, it's pretty damn good. If you're looking at a nature scene, and we did a lot of customer consumer testing with this, where if you're in a nature scene, actually the immersion and the presence really works with VR because nothing is happening in the environment that wouldn't happen otherwise if you weren't there. So if you're standing on the sand on an ocean, you can't really do anything to that environment that's going to change it. So here comes this person walking down the path, and I cannot say hello to her. All of a sudden, I'm like a ghost, watching in on this thing that I have no way to interact with. And it was such a fundamental violation to me in this experiential environment that I was placed, that I couldn't believe that the producer wasn't taking into consideration this element of the media environment. And it set me on a mission. And so since then, I've been just heavily immersed in the space of AI and natural language processing and what can be done with that. And because this is the technology that's going to be required in order to have that kind of experience work, where you've got two characters talking, and if the user is a character inside that media environment, that's the technology that at least is the beginning of a way to get to a conversational experience. Now, right now, we know it as Siri and Alexa. We talk to our phone, when does the movie start tonight, right? You can say basic commands into your Siri and Alexa, or if you've got some other voice. And we've got all of our smart speakers that have all the different voice technologies on there. Amazon Alexa, Siri, all of them. They all do the same thing, where you've got a one-dimensional conversation where you can give a command, and that's about as far as it can go. There's no two-way conversation, because as soon as you open up two-way conversation, you step into the domain of a narrative. And since you don't know what the user's narrative is coming into that conversation, you can never build a system to handle every unique user. Everybody has a different goal. Everybody has a unique, this complex space of human desire coming into human conversation. And so this is the question that I'm working on. So long story short, 3 years ago, we partnered with USC, and we produced this agent prototype. This was specifically with the Institute for Creative Technologies at USC in Los Angeles. And they've been working with the Army. For the past 15 years since they've been in operation. And they've been working with soldiers with PTSD coming over, and these soldiers are shut down. Right? They can't talk about their feelings. And a lot of it has to do with, maybe soldier identity issues. They gotta stay macho. They can never be sort of vulnerable. And so they've been doing a lot of work in this area of emotive recognition in the conversations. And so we started, we partnered in creating this demo that I'm going to show you. I've got a video of me explaining the demo. It's a lot easier than me trying to help you visualize it. And I want you to be aware that this is a demo that we did for our board of directors as a vision for what might show up in probably 8 to 10 years. So we're staging a few of the things with the two-way conversation, but this is an authentic look at the user's emotional trajectory through the course of a conversation. So I'm going to fire this up. I got the wrong one open there, I think. Okay. So this goes for about 3.5 minutes. Uh-oh. What do I need to do?
Go to your top, the sound preferences should do it. That's what I had to do.
An innovation project engineer at Cable Labs. I'm here to explain the AI agent demo that's been produced in partnership with USC's Institute for Creative Technologies. What we have is our AI agent on the right. We have the AI brain that's running the agent on the left. And in the center, we have a user that's playing a bullied teenager. So the agent on the right, has lots of nonverbal behaviors like rapport building techniques like gaze and different postures that are used to make the conversation feel much more natural. Over here on the brain, there's a lot going on here, but basically it's input into the system on the left, and then on the right is the system logic that is governing the performance of the agent. And then in the center, we have a measurement of the user's emotional state. Every time the user says something, we get a new plot point showing up on the graph. So with that, I'm going to have Taylor take it away, and we'll see this in action.
Hello.
Hey Taylor, it's good to see you again. How are you today?
Terrible.
That's hard. What's going on?
People are so mean. I was at my locker and this girl pushed all my books out of my hands in front of everyone. I felt like such an idiot.
These feelings are a completely natural reaction.
I started picking up my stuff and nobody would help, and some people started laughing. I was so humiliated. I just can't believe how mean people can be.
Sounds like you're feeling sad.
I know we've been over this, but I just wanted to punch that stupid girl.
Fear causes your body to go into protection mode, and that can cause you to lash out at those who are threatening you.
I don't really want to hurt anyone. I just wish things would go back to the way they were last year.
Uh-huh. How do you make yourself feel better when you're down?
Thank you, Taylor. So as you can see, we've got new inputs coming into the system on the left. We have our user emotional plot points showing up on the graph, and we have a whole emotional history that we get from that. And then we also have the system reasoning that's governing the performance of the agent. Now, we can do a manual override on the system to demonstrate how the agent might animate differently depending on the input from the user. So you just saw the agent lean forward, and you also saw a color change in the background. Now that's simply just to demonstrate that the different environmental elements can change depending on the input from the user. Now what's easier is getting the emotion of the user. What's really hard is understanding what that emotion means for the user's narrative during the conversation. That's when the technology turns into an art form. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so to keep in mind the AI technology that's used here, there's a few different AI technologies that are being used. One is the emotive AI that comes into this. This was done by word choice. Now, what's important to understand about AI input coming into the system is that you can get it in lots of different ways. You can get it with vocal word choice, and that's sentiment analysis that's used for that. Or you can do facial recognition. There's now MIT's got a great solution for that now. It's just a plug-in API. It now works in Unity if you're building games. You can get it with actual behavioral postures that you can pick up. Am I looking down? Am I looking off to the side? How long have I been looking down and off to the side for? Again, there's a couple other ways to do it. Again, getting the emotion read into the system is pretty easy. Nobody knows what to do with it, though. Nobody knows how to really build that narrative that drives the users, I want to say their desire through their journey in this particular story or their story. And this is where I get into trouble with people all the time, because I kind of go off the deep end. I've got a major argument about why story is not working in any platform that has 6 degrees of freedom, whether that be augmented reality, virtual reality. I include social robotics with that. Consider social robotics as just the inverse of VR.
What is 6 degrees of freedom?
6 degrees of freedom is meaning that you can move forwards and backwards, left and right. You can duck up and down, but you also have pitch, roll, yaw, and the 3 degrees of just standing and looking in all directions. Basically, it's full agency inside your physical space. So if I have my goggles on, I can move around and get in and out and do this, right? Versus 3 degrees of freedom, all I can do is, I'm stuck in one place, but I can look around like this. So as a filmmaker, this is an impossible storytelling arena because you immediately take control of the camera away from the director. All of a sudden, the user is now in control of what the camera is doing. And so the argument that James Cameron pointed out, which he's right about, is that that turns the media environment into a gaming environment. It's basically like a joystick. Right? You've got your VR on, and instead of a joystick, you're moving your head around, and you're moving in and out like this. But what Cameron, that's another story. So when we talk about, and here's the analogy that I use. Cinema and gaming are both observational media platforms. You sit down and you consume the media in that way. And this is very similar when we get into gaming. It's because we have more interaction when it comes to gaming. But think about it like a kid with a stick and poking and prodding at an anthill. Right? He can do that and he can watch all the ants move around, but that experience remains observational. As soon as you put that kid into a playground with that stick to poke and prod at it, no, that doesn't work. You want to get rid of the stick and you just want to go play. And that's what we call full agency, right? We have full agency now in the playground, but there's no driving narrative for the main character, which is the user. And this, we really need, in terms of creating narratives for 6 degrees of freedom. Social robotics, I also include holographics that are coming. This is all about getting into volume of media. We have a volumetric experience. We can move about. We may or may not need goggles to do that in the future, but we will be doing that. Volumetric experiences are coming. How do we handle the narratives of that? We really need to be asking that question and looking at how to handle somebody's driving desires. As a storyteller, what you're working with is human desire and the character arc that gets that person through that antagonism of that story. And this is not something that you can pre-bake and put into a system and have a user come into it, because if you do that, then you're in a gaming environment again, and you're having the user, you're sort of like defining what the user's desire should be coming into that story. So I'm going to stop there. I could go on and on. I'd like to take some questions and then move on to the panel. Yeah. Yeah.
So I thought that commentary was excellent. It was very, very interesting. And I absolutely tend to agree with that. You have a theory for what could make that experience more compelling from a narrative standpoint?
I do have a theory.
Can I repeat the question?
Yeah. So the question is, do I have a theory about what could help the narrative experience? I do have a theory. So, and it's really pretty simple, actually, but it's pretty complex in terms of application of it. So, character arcs come from mythology. It was Joseph Campbell that pointed out all the hero's journey and all the stages of the journey, and the Jungian psychology of the archetypal assimilation. This is what movies are. This is a character, when they go through their arc, through the story, they are assimilating an archetype. And that's like a mental exercise for how someone might go about this archetypal assimilation. But to do it in reality for the user requires handling actual perception, actual emotion, actual fears. And it requires stepping, I don't want to say away from the fantasy element of cinema and storytelling, but it requires that we're handling real-world reaction to antagonism. And I think that's where the opportunity is. I don't want to get too far out, in the clouds on this. I already am. But I tend to think that, and we need to be able to handle that for every user in a way that's custom for that user's psyche. Everybody has their own emotional reactions. Everybody's different. Everybody's got personal histories and sensitivities and quirks about how they handle things in their life. And the system needs to be able to handle all this. Where I'm really excited is I believe that AI has the potential to do that. I think there's a way to do this. I think there's a way to do. I have theories about mass journey pathways, like a movie with, a million different pathways that you could go through, and then those get mapped out.
Let's take one more question. We'll go to the panel. Go ahead.
So the question that I have is about, when you're talking of understanding the emotions of the person, doesn't that also go into a place wherein, my emotions I feel are something that is very intimate, and if we have a machine that's learning it, now do we really want the machine to understand it such that, since you are the creator of the machine and the system,
Right.
and if you have figured out something about me, then, so let's say if I'm suicidal and you have figured it out, doesn't that question come about as to, okay, the system has figured it out, should that system suddenly take an action? Should it inform someone else? So all these questions would, how, when you're thinking of learning emotions and trying to build an application, at the same time, don't these other aspects come in, and how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we very much entertained those questions as we were making this prototype that I just showed you. This specific therapist experience that I showed you was actually designed to be a counseling filler for schools that didn't have counselors on site, because it was specifically built for a kid who's been bullied at school. And so the idea was to get the kids to just get in there and start talking about their feelings in some way. And so you have at least a beginning of some kind of an idea about how they're feeling. But but to really get at your question, I kind of think about it like movies. We all know that movies are fake. They're not real. I can turn to you and say, that was stupid, right? And we're watching a movie. But we allow the suspension of disbelief when we watch a movie because it's a compelling experience. We want to do it. We want to go through it. And I think my idea, and I could be wrong, but my idea is that we're not fooling anybody. We're not going to pass the Turing test anytime soon. And we're going to come into these experiences and hopefully have some kind of a compelling interaction with these agents in some way that makes it so that we want to come back to it. If it doesn't work, then we don't come back to it. It's not that we're going to be fooled. But yeah, these are ethical questions that really need to be explored. And I think we have a long ways to go. So this is the very beginning. This is all visionary stuff. A lot of work to do.
Eric, let's pause for a second and thank Eric for a super stimulating discussion. We'll take the last seat over there, going to the panel discussion. And Vikas, can we get you a handheld mic, one of the two?
Yeah.
Or do you have?
I guess I could use. I can talk last too.
Let's do it, just in terms of being able to hear. So I'm going to start with a couple questions, and we'll just open it up. But Brian and Lori, I want to start with you in terms of, Brian, this is right in your sweet spot in terms of user experience. I was fascinated by the idea, and when Eric and I talked about this for the first time, I just didn't think about the 6 degrees of freedom and being able to do more in a virtual reality environment as being far less from a narrative and user experience perspective. That's just a really interesting dilemma or paradox. What are your reactions to some of the things that Eric said?
Well, thanks for bringing it all up. That was great. I think that when we're telling stories, we definitely want to be involved with the story, and obviously VR is nowhere near being able to from a director's point of view, taking those million points of view or those million different, I guess, trails to go down. We're not there yet. We won't be there for a very long time. But I think that if the archetype is not the people we're dealing with, but rather ourselves. So if you are the archetype, you become that story itself. And so VR, I think, VR has two things that it really needs to succeed, and that's place. You have to be somewhere that's recognizable to the user and emotes has an emotional response, right? So you brought up the nature walk type thing. And the second thing is presence. And when we have presence, which you brought up, presence is this thing where you actually feel like you're in the room. And I don't know if you've ever tried this, like, Cisco's spending a lot of money right now moving their product telepresence into a VR universe where you actually feel like you're in the room, and it's impossible to not feel like you're in the room. So now when we're seeing massive multiplayer gaming kind of go this direction where gamers can interact with one another so they are the story, and then the VR only supports the story as their place. Mm-hmm. And so there's another way to think about it where you are the archetype. But I liked first of all, this is a great way to do safe spaces really cheaply. I thought that presentation, that was kind of cool. And if you noticed how we all got a little nervous when the computer didn't answer quite quickly enough. Mm-hmm. So, right, because I saw everybody go, whoa, they kind of move in and wait for it, right? And we could solve that with putting a out of the therapist, that kind of stuff, maybe once in a while.
Yeah, we can do, there's a few different buffering creative solutions for that.
But you guys are really close, too. So the human brain right now has got the reason people are getting sick a little bit in some of the headsets is a 6 millisecond.
Well,
break,
I won't say
right?
we have to sell the concept of edge compute, basically turning the whole cable network into a giant distributed supercomputer to the industry, which is a major turnkey investment for everybody. But we're using VR as an argument to do that, and the future volumetric experiences to do that.
I wasn't cutting the. That was amazing. It was just that was not. I'm just saying that that's another hurdle VR has to get over, right? And even if it's in an experience like that, and you could probably find solutions to that in the emotional response of the users. So if you studied enough people in therapy sessions, you could probably get a real sense of what that therapist could do to waste a little time while she's processing. Mm-hmm. That was my only suggestion.
Laura, if I could pull you in. I got to believe with your background, you think a lot about narrative.
I do, actually. And my background is actually in experimental poetry and poetics. So I have the strong, background that's very critical of narrative, actually, in the way that there's linearity built into narrative that can be restrictive and politically not capacious enough, if that makes sense. So I was actually thinking while you were talking that there could be a lot of upsides to narrative not working, that it has the ability to upset traditional hierarchies. I mean, like the idea of turning the viewer into a camera is actually incredible, and it's what the avant-garde has wanted to achieve for a long time. So that was one thing I was thinking about.
Super interesting. Max?
There's a lot to think of in this space, and echoing Lori's point, I quickly was immediately kind of disinterested in VR for narrative, partly because the conceit right now is technological barriers. I mean, Intel is putting in this major light field imaging stage in LA to try to build, a volumetric spatial cinematic experience that you could walk through, and even that, at its best in a few years, won't even be procedural, meaning kind of as you've described, kind of game, in essence, interactive, branching narratives, maybe branching narratives, but to branch narratives, you need a lot more procedural design down the characters, and even characters and the replication, the kind of aesthetic goal of replicating this reality with humans that look like us, that are humanoid, that have these limbs and for me, that's not really the first goal that comes to mind. but I do recognize as well for so many cases like therapies for evoking our emotive sense, our social sense, ideas of compassion, neural mirroring, that it's an important tool to be working with the human form and human photorealism. But I also am really interested in the fact that we're now able to build like choreographic, like architectural narratives. When you think now that like we can sort of choreograph with architecture and change spaces on you really quickly, and that like we have a biophilic, psychological, adapted like evolutionary response to our space, we can now use that to evoke people's, like if somebody's scared about being bullied, like we can put them in architecture, like you changed the color. I thought that was wonderful. You could change the space that gives them a more, like they, people were like, just now I saw an article about Zuckerberg sitting on a 4-inch booster seat. And there was like people weighing in and all kinds of things about how that put him in a position of more confidence and stuff. And it was like, it's architectural, right? Sort of vantage point, and there's a reason that they put the Congress people speaking from up here and on high. And so I just think the things that we can do with architecture alone are really fascinating. And you can tell a narrative with 2 spheres. Like you can tell a love story with 2 simple primitives, So like, I don't know, anyway, you can tell that I'm there's a lot to unpack.
Mike, want to loop you in? Reactions from your end?
Sure. I just thought the spectrum, I don't know to what extent it was deliberate, that you convened here tonight was brilliant, and to the panel, because what I think is super interesting is that with all of these different advancements, both on the compute side, on the hardware side, on the AI side, in the arts, what I think you're starting to see are a lot of pioneering, incredibly smart people out starting to toe into these different frontiers. And what you often see in the early stage of a lot of these trends are folks working within the context of their respective silos. And traditionally, those silos are going to remain silos for years, if not decades. But because of just how hyper fast everything evolves these days, I think out of the gate, you're already starting to see the convergence of these incredibly wonderful and rich disciplines starting to engage with each other. And that's what I'm really most interested in seeing kind of continue to evolve, are the convergence of these spheres of influence from these different industries. And I think about that kind of from a software perspective on a more regular basis, because that's where we are as in developing applications, particularly for professionals. But I think about some of the trends that are emerging or have emerged and are kind of almost standard now in the software space, where software, highly interactive, right? Imagine a software application where you're presented with a user interface and you can't click the buttons. Not unlike the scenario Eric was describing, not being able to interact with Reese Witherspoon as she was walking down the path. But we take for granted in software that you can click a button and something's going to happen. What onus is placed now on software developers is that that's not enough. It also has to be beautiful. It has to be intuitive. It has to provide an experience. In the software world, we start talking now about competing on experience. In the media and entertainment world, it's almost the opposite. It's, yeah, of course it's going to be entertaining. Of course it's going to be beautiful. Of course it's going to be compelling. Where the competition lines are starting to emerge, given the technology paradigms that are evolving now, are on the interaction. Can you establish agency? Can you create not only a compelling narrative, but can the consumer begin to interact in a way that creates a new kind of experience? That to me is a convergence that is super interesting. It's super interesting too when you start to look at what's happening in the art world, where a lot of these same themes are starting to emerge, where it's not enough to stand in front of a painting and admire its beauty. Artists now are starting to get into the world of immersive, interactive experiences. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens there, particularly when some of these artists and communities begin to explore things like augmented and virtual and mixed reality platforms, and how the storytelling and the narrative and the media and the entertainment and the gaming and all that stuff kind of starts to converge around some of these different technologies. Man, that's what I'm super, super excited about. And we can already start to see that happening in places like Boulder, which makes this a pretty cool place to hang out.
All right, Max is out from Boston, so we're in recruiting mode.
Yeah, well, he said he's thinking about moving to town, so it's going to be like.
Vikas, one more question. We'll open up to audience. Going back to your visualization of sort of the VR stack, if you will, where at the top there's applications that are going to merge for AR, VR. In the middle at the logic layer, you had artificial intelligence and perception tools. And then at the bottom, you had different versions of hardware. Would you consider it to be a friendly amendment to what Eric said in terms of at the bottom, in terms of, and Eric, disabuse me if I got it wrong, you talk about a massive supercomputer that the cable industry or the delivery mechanisms of telecom would have to commit to. Is that what you had in mind maybe first, Eric? And then if so, Vikas, would you consider that to be like the very bottom of the stack? Eric, is that what you had in mind?
Well, in order for it to scale to millions and millions of people using simultaneously, because you can't ask the common user to go out and buy a gaming computer for their home. It's just not going to scale. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, in terms of magnitude of improvement, I'm thinking about in terms of bandwidth, throughput and processing power. Are those the two things?
So the issue with VR is latency, not bandwidth. So,
right, so for you're talking to your grandma or grandpa, explain it in terms of bandwidth.
So low latency is, VR requires low latency, which is 11 milliseconds. It's actually 19 milliseconds, but the round trip low latency to get VR to work in 6 degrees of freedom is 11 milliseconds, which means that you cannot send a photon of light to Seattle to a server and back in time. That takes I think it's 30 or 40 milliseconds to do that. So VR cannot be delivered at scale until you have servers that are handling that compute nearby to make that round trip 11 milliseconds. And this is what cable does, right? So we've done this with IP video forever, but we've got IP video solutions out doing that. That's what we do. That's why you can watch Netflix, right, over the top. But when it starts, now that media is going in the direction of volumetrics and compute, our media is being generated by compute on the fly as we're moving through the universe of the media. In order to deliver that to everybody, we need to have a supercomputer running on the edge. We call it the edge, where it's just right outside in Denver, and it's just like bam, bam, and back. That millisecond low latency is resolved, and we can deliver the VR experience.
So super interesting.
So all you need are goggles, and you can do VR.
And is this going to be sort of the equivalent of a content delivery network locally, but for computing power? Am I thinking about that?
Yeah, it's just the new paradigm for media delivery into the home. Like, it's going to have to be solved by somebody. Amazon might beat us to it. They might buy up real estate all over the country and put servers and deliver low latency. Well, if they do, then we'll be a competitor to them for that. So, but this is a major discussion in the cable industry right now.
And I would say there's two competing things there, because there's also the current trend of just compute getting cheaper, faster. That's still happening right now. So, there's the next wave of, so a lot of people are, there's right now to run PC, or to run these high-end games, it requires a nice PC. But in the next, there's stuff that Oculus is coming out with Santa Cruz. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that's coming out pretty soon that's going to have the 6DoF tracking built into the thing. It'll be a fully self-contained, probably sub $400 headset with everything all built in. And so the graphics.
You could bring the.
Oh yeah, sorry, my bad. So I think that'll be, but that doesn't necessarily. I'm not saying that doesn't negate what you're saying. I'm just saying that there are certain experiences that basically you could sort of say all the current stuff that you're seeing on PC VR today, that'll be possible on mobile. I think within the next year or so, or maybe totally, 2 years, right? But then
totally
beyond that, then you start to get into there's some stuff you can do when you have like edge computing. I could see being really interesting for. Imagine this, like every user is walking around a city, they're pointing their phone around, or they've got cameras that they're wearing as part of their AR display, and they're helping build even like a live 3D model of that entire city. That's like pretty possible. It's not, and there you necessarily need to like sort of shuffle that off to something that's a server, and yeah, there are some constraints around that, and that cuts both. And then some of the stuff that's in machine learning and some of those things make more sense to run sort of on a different computer that's sort of storing up all this data. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different solutions that are coming for this. Cable might not have to do edge compute, but what we do need is we need to deliver extremely low latency compute into the home in some way. And maybe television manufacturers do it, and they provide the compute in the home. And we just plug in a little thing and we can do VR because the TV handles it. Or there's a concept called edgeless compute, where all the thousands of IoT devices in your home are going to compute together, and create all the compute you're going to need for your home. Regardless of how the compute gets there, we're moving from this sort of passive display that we've got, and we're sitting on the couch, and we're moving into volumetric experiences throughout the home. However that media shows up and however that compute gets there, it's all coming. So this is one way that cable can play in the game. So that's how I talk.
All right, so incredibly, if you look at your program, we are right back on schedule, ready for audience questions. Let's fire away. Yep, let's go up there. Actually behind you, right behind you, in the blue shirt. Yep.
So my question is actually related to security and privacy. It was touched on over there. VR and AR are essentially one step closer to man-machine interaction. When the machine starts to know more about you or is more capable of interacting with you, do we have concerns? Do any of you have concerns about, malicious actors, agencies, intelligences, working to more efficiently, convince someone of something or make them think a certain way?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like the thing I'd be worried about is, a lot of the stuff, even some of the stuff that I talked about, perception, or even other things like even the sort of emotional stuff that Eric talked about or picking up on those can definitely be used as, obviously maybe the technology itself is somewhat neutral, but the way you use it doesn't necessarily have to be. And so, like, it can definitely be a tool of government oppression, for example, if it's like, hey, actually detecting when, what are people's emotional responses to our dear leader? Is it positive? Is it negative? No comment on current state of affairs. That's the kind of stuff that's, and it's kind of scary, looking at, I never thought this was possible. At China, they've actually implemented this firewall, and it's not like a perfect firewall against all the content. They just introduced just enough friction to where people just go about their daily lives and they just don't bother. It's not like you can buy it with a VPN, but that kind of stuff where it's subtle friction stuff could be very damaging. Yeah.
I don't know. Last time I was in Hong Kong, all my VPNs failed.
Yeah, there you go.
Because China got much better with those
controls now. Yeah.
But I think we're all concerned, and for those of us who are going to be building this stuff, it is a concern. But then money usually trumps whatever we're concerned about, doesn't it? Because you're still on Facebook. All right. So that's what we find with users is that people don't really care as much as they scream about their privacy. Which is interesting to me, because it's kind of like I always say there are two very serious things you need to know about people when you're building software or hardware. Is one, everybody thinks they can multitask, and then the truth is no one in this room can multitask. Two cognitive things at once. It's absolutely impossible, yet we all think we can. So we all think we're really concerned about privacy, but especially the last couple weeks, we really aren't. So I think it's kind of incumbent on those who are building it to put it in if people want it. And we might be coming to an edge here too as soon as we get the immediate delivery of real VR and AR experiences. We might be coming to a place where we are ourselves as online citizens. And that kind of changes the game a little bit too. That removes the trolling and that kind of stuff, and you get to see who you're dealing with. I think we're going to come to that in short order as well.
Lori, you raised some anxieties before. Any additional ones that you'd add?
Oh, I have many. But yeah, they're the same as all the audience concerns. Actually, I've been thinking about it, and I mentioned this, Brian, actually, just as we started the session, is this sounds naive, I understand, but there's no ethics built into capitalism. That's really the problem. Nobody's under any ethical obligation to build it right. And my opinion actually is that people are deeply freaked out about privacy, or at least you know, the students that I'm engaging with who are 18 to 25 years old are deeply, deeply worried. And it's not at all that they don't care. It's actually something like the fact that community is coercive, if that makes any sense. All of their friends are on Facebook, so you're going to miss connections with people if you're not on Facebook. So it's not at all that they don't care. So,
But that tribalism wins.
what do you mean?
We're all on Facebook, so we have to be on Facebook too.
No, not at all.
Oh.
But all I'm saying is that I think that makers are under an obligation to build an
Oh, I
ethics
agree,
into the
yeah.
tech,
That's
and
one
not just
point.
rely on their impression.
And
of
since
what-
we're in the law school, I'll put a plug that privacy is an area that Silicon Flatirons does events around. And we have a new privacy scholar coming in, Margot Kaminsky, who will be leading that initiative. And there's some fascinating questions here, including where do you put the default in terms of who owns information related to the demo is fabulous, right? In terms of this emotional scans of the woman who is using the device, who owns that information in terms of what? And there's a very important role for regulators in that. I won't go much further, but that's something that we're going to be working with. Next question. Yep.
I'm interested in your predictions in the next 5 to 10 years. You said something earlier about the killer app. I'm a little bit more interested in enterprise use cases. So maybe any thinking that you have on what does this mean to financials, big financial companies and insurance companies, healthcare and pharma, transportation and logistics. How are enterprises going to leverage this? My question is not a 20-year out edge compute, the world looks different. I'm interested in the near term, 5 to 10 years. What's your take?
I can describe one, possibility is like, and I think very realistically is going to happen with AR is that right now, if you look at a lot of tasks, like things like going to a remote oil and gas facility to repair it, or even basic stuff like plumbing, which does require a lot of training to like become build expert level. A lot of those, right now, a lot of those are tied to the experts themselves having to go on site because it's hard to, it's just there's no technology currently that they can use to sort of get there, and so they have to fly out to somewhere in the middle of the Indonesian Sea for oil and gas stuff, or they have to the most expert plumber has to come to your house, or you get the really bad one who isn't able to fix stuff. And so I think there is going to be this one of the enterprise applications will be sort of this or something that enterprises might do is centralizing some of the expertise. So imagine instead of that you've got all of your expert plumbers are all in one place in like Ohio or something. But they're actually able to, leverage that expertise across the entire United States or across the world because they're able to sort of be teleported into all these different locations. And that applies, of course, in medicine as well. And like, there's some efforts now where it's like, there's people that are sort of in that vein where you do some sort of telemedicine because you're able to, instead of just being there, in fact, maybe it's better than being there because you get all of their vital signs, you've got sensors reading all this stuff about them, and you have enough of a presence to sort of have an emotional connection with that person. So I think that's something that's going to happen in the next probably 5 to 10 years, maybe probably in that horizon.
Mike, I suspect you guys are thinking about this as well.
Yeah, that's our sweet spot, so I appreciate the question. That's a perfect tee-up. So I'll invite you after the session to come and get a demo of one of the applications that we've built, which is targeting professionals within the construction industry. That goes for everyone here in the room, where workflows, particularly those around communication, collaboration, visualization, some sort of visual analysis of a physical environment, are incredibly transformed, I would say, by some of these technologies, particularly in the mixed reality and augmented reality space, where you have the opportunity to overlay digital information atop an actual real-world physical space. And there are use cases after use cases that I could get into specific to the construction industry, but the industries that you mentioned, I don't know if construction is of particular interest, but when you start talking about transportation and healthcare and some of these other industries, I've seen a lot of examples of applications that are being developed primarily for education, because from an educational perspective, again, when you think about communication, am I reading text in a textbook? This was kind of the example earlier. Am I looking at a photograph of the Declaration of Independence? Am I watching a film about Abraham Lincoln and his, giving of the speech? Or am I in an immersive environment in which I have 6 degrees of freedom and I have the ability to participate in the narrative that's being delivered? And from an educational perspective, what is it? A picture is worth 1,000 words. You can only imagine what it's worth to be able to develop a compelling, rich media, high production value, like quality experience for some of these enterprises, and what that does in terms of getting employees ramped up to speed, establishing clarity and consistency in those kinds of experiences, particularly in industries where you're legitimately talking about life and death situations. There's an incredible amount of investment and value inherent to being able to develop solutions within that space. And that's just the beginning. That's just because that's the most feasible opportunity. When you start to get into some of the more visionary stuff that Vikas was talking about, having to do with the compute power and the devices and the software and everything else, being able to augment a professional's experience in real time, in a real environment, given any myriad of situational circumstances or variables, that's when it's going to get like crazy interesting. And we're starting to see some of that at Trimble. Trimble isn't just in the construction industry, but we have applications across mining and transportation and logistics, agriculture, civil planning, infrastructure construction, and we're exploring augmented and virtual reality applications across that entire landscape of businesses. So, next question.
Thank you. Want to Folk in Blue. Mimetic warfare is a thing. Weaponized memes are a thing, and it will be something we'll have to deal with in the VR and AR environment moving forward. Thank you for bringing up fog computing or edgeless computing. About that, Trimble, same thing with the enterprise applications. It's something I'm looking into. I'd like to talk to you about it. But I actually have a question I'd like to focus directly towards Lori, but the rest of the panel can answer as well. So we've talked about, I don't think we've kind of broached it, but access to this technology, classism, sexism, every ism you can think of, and making sure that accessibility is there. But also, it's not just, okay, if you don't have access, that's a problem, but what can we use, how can we use VR and AR to help break down barriers between all the isms that we like to describe each, minds, these, this consciousness as? Yeah. Let's start with Lori.
Yeah.
That's an awesome question, and that's something I've been thinking about this evening myself. I'm not sure because I don't really work in VR, but generally speaking, I think one of the key things is to make sure that seams are built into the platform, in my sense anyway, instead of making it continuously seamless and invisible and smooth, which always glosses over whose sense of perception and whose intuition and whose sense of the world has been built into the platform, and instead the seams actually reveal how it's informing how you're seeing the world. Do you see what I'm saying? So to me, that would be a start. I don't know what that actually looks like, though, I have to say. Yeah.
Well, we've spent some time thinking about this. I don't know. So I'm a capitalist, and yeah, so it's not, but I think if we recreate or make a similar world to where we are now, we can have all these same questions in a virtual universe type environment. We're always going to have a problem with language or not recognizing a face or that kind of thing, because maybe Indian designers, are you an Indian person?
Yeah.
So maybe should have made the facial recognition. I don't know, right? But whatever that is, that's a very serious issue that hopefully we can try to, when we make software, we try to make it for one person, right? We try to identify for one person. But then we do enough testing so that we know we can hit every person that might be picking up that software. And I think that's the real key, is to be real conscious of how we're handling it. And as far as access goes, I don't think this is going to be super, super expensive. I think that we're already paying a cable bill. We're already buying $700, $800 phones.
We are not. I mean, I'm not, and I'm pretty solidly middle class. But there's a lot of people in Boulder actually who don't have cable and don't have smartphones, and those are the people I'm worried about.
Yeah, and so I don't, right. But I think that as far, no, that's fine. So actually, but having a web address right now costs about $7.99 to $15.99 per year. Owning a domain, having internet access, if you wanted to go to the library, is free, but at home it costs probably $29 to $59, right, for decent speed. That seems to be with what's the rate of internet access for the American population?
I don't know.
91% or something like that?
I'm not sure.
Right. So I don't know that we're going to add that much more added expense. But we did see VR. So VR is brand new, right? And AR is brand new. And we did see these. They made about $5 million in hardware last year, or billion rather, and $5 billion in software. The community did, and that's supposed to be larger than the personal computing market in 2023. That's 5 years away and $160 billion a year. That's how compelling this stuff is, but we're not going to get there with $1,000 rigs. And so the $400 rig coming out, and by the way, I've never seen technology move this quickly, or haven't seen it move this quickly since every other electronics company in the world was pissed off at Apple for making this thing called the iPhone, right? Because we had but every 4 months there's a new thing that happens in VR and AR.
Yeah, I think there's two aspects of, I think, access and what happens on those platforms. I think because even if you can't
microphone.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks for reminding. I think even if you can't access them, there's there's the sort of penalty you pay for perhaps being not the sort of targeted audience. And so yeah, it could be that the VR experience wasn't tuned to you, and like Lori pointed out about motion sickness or different things are experienced differently by people. I think there is and especially I think I mentioned this before, but as we get into things that involve machine learning and things that are more and more immersive, like if we're not accounting for some of our own biases, we're just going to replicate those in a even worse way on these new platforms. And I think there is something to be said about this. Business models actually do matter, because there are certain business models, as we've seen with Facebook and others, that inherently, you are the product. You're the person being, your data is being sold because, or if it's advertising, if it's, other companies have less of an issue with this, but there is no inherent sort of ethics built into, I would say, whether it's capitalism or even just technology itself. And the use of that is something that we have to be cognizant of as we go, especially as we go forward to new technologies. I really hope we don't just copy all the same bullshit issues that we have with people getting harassed on Twitter because they're a certain race or women. I hope those types of issues don't just walk their way over to VR and AR and these new platforms and robotics. So that's my hope anyway. I don't know if that's going to happen.
All right, well, a couple things before we move over to the reception. One is some thank yous. The Silicon Flatirons team, I get to do a lot of talking, but Vanessa, Kelly was here, all the student volunteers, please help me give them a thank you. Second, Ryan, Justin, Zach, many thanks for coming and doing the demo, as well as the folks from Trimble and SketchUp. Their demo is still going to be outside, as well as Walkthrough was here earlier. They had to leave, but we'll have some of the demos. Please help me thank the folks who have taken the trouble to do that. Great. And finally, let's see, Vikas, Eric, Mike, Max, Lori, and Brian, as well as the folks from Silicon Legal. This room, many of you have probably been here back when we used to host the New Tech Meetup. And Robert Rich was kind of a maestro at bringing together a Geek Fest that I always felt like it kind of helped me look around the next corner, or maybe 2 corners down. And you guys really helped in terms of that spirit of helping us see around the next corner. Please help me give the panelists a warm thank you.
We'll be moving next door for the reception.
Are you here?
I am, yeah.